Imagine sitting on a plane, ready to settle in for a peaceful flight, when the person next to you suddenly refuses to sit next to you. Not because of anything you've done, but because of the color of your skin. What would you do if you were the one being judged? And what happens when that same person discovers who you really are? Get ready for a twist that will leave you speechless. Before we start, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more exciting videos. The morning had been just like any other, the air buzzing with the usual hustle and bustle of an airport. People rushed through terminals, moving from one gate to another, while flight attendants in crisp uniforms greeted travelers as they walked past. Among the crowd was a white man named Thomas, dressed in a sharp suit and carrying a well-worn leather briefcase. He appeared confident, perhaps even a bit too self-assured, as he navigated through the busy space. He was a frequent flyer, accustomed to the luxury of first-class cabins and the comfort they promised. He'd always prided himself on his punctuality and the sense of superiority that came with being a regular in the higher cabins. As Thomas made his way to the gate, he noticed a woman sitting alone by the window, reading a book. She was in her mid-30s, with neatly tied back hair and a professional demeanor. Her name was Erica. She wore a navy blue uniform that matched the sleek, polished look of the airline. Thomas couldn't help but glance at her as he passed by. She wasn't the type of person he'd normally expect to see in first class. At least, that's what he assumed. He didn't know why, but something about her made him uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, so calm and collected. Or perhaps it was just his own biases that quietly nudged him to judge her based on appearances. He tried to push the thought away, telling himself it didn't matter. He had a seat in first class, and she wasn't part of his concern. But as he approached the gate, he noticed the woman again, walking toward the same line. She was heading to the same boarding area as him, and it didn't sit right with him. His mind raced with unspoken judgments. He quickly glanced at the others in the queue, noting their outfits, their demeanor, and how they seemed to belong in a space like first class. He thought nothing of the others, except for her. When it was time to board, Thomas scanned his boarding pass and headed down the jet bridge. As he entered the plane, he looked around the first-class section, searching for his seat. The plush seats and large windows filled with natural light had always been his favorite part of flying. He wanted to settle in, get comfortable, and relax. But as he glanced over his shoulder, he saw Erica once again. She was heading toward the first-class cabin, just like him. Thomas couldn't help but feel uneasy. There was no real reason for it, but something about her made him feel uncomfortable. He quickly found his seat, sat down, and buckled his seatbelt. Still, his eyes drifted back toward Erica. She was near the front of the plane now, standing by the aisle, scanning the seating chart. She was preparing to settle into a seat nearby, in a section that Thomas had always thought was reserved for people who were used to the luxury of first class. Just before the door was closed, as the final passengers were boarding, Erica walked up to the seat next to Thomas. He straightened in his seat, ready to settle into a few hours of solitude. But instead, to his surprise, she paused at the seat across the aisle. There was a brief moment of hesitation, and then Erica turned around. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "I'm afraid there seems to be a mistake. That's actually my seat," she continued, pointing at the seat Thomas had been planning to occupy. For a brief moment, Thomas was stunned. He didn't understand. He had no idea what the issue could be. There was no way she could be seated here. After all, she didn't look the part. He was about to speak when Erica's eyes met his, and she gave him a polite but resolute smile. "Could you please check again?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was a slight edge to it. It was almost as if she was already expecting him to resist. Thomas blinked, still processing what was happening. He took a deep breath, deciding to follow the social protocol. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat," he replied with a smile, though his voice held a quiet firmness. Erica's smile remained, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you sure?" she asked again, as if testing him. She wasn't angry, not yet, but her calmness was unsettling. Thomas felt the tension building in the air, a discomfort that seemed to grow with every passing second. Now Thomas could feel his irritation starting to bubble up. "I'm positive," he said, a little more curtly this time. "I've been traveling in first class for years, and I know where my seat is." He shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of the moment, but more so the unease that came from not knowing why she was challenging him. Erica, undeterred, looked down at her boarding pass. Her gaze met his once more, and there was something different in her eyes now, something far more powerful than the polite mask she'd been wearing before. "I'm the pilot of this flight," she said simply, her tone even. "And I think you'll find that this seat is actually mine." Thomas froze. For a moment, the words didn't make sense. "You're the pilot?" he repeated, as though saying them again might somehow change the reality of what he had just heard. Erica didn't seem to be joking. Her calm demeanor only reinforced the seriousness of the statement. She was the pilot. The woman he had so quickly judged based on her appearance, the one he had assumed didn't belong in the first-class cabin, was the one who would be flying the plane. Thomas's face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and disbelief settling over him. How had he misjudged her so thoroughly? The irony was too much to bear. She wasn't just a passenger. She was in charge of the very flight he was about to take. The realization hit him like a sudden wave, making him feel small in ways he hadn't experienced in years. Here he was, a man who prided himself on his professional life, his successful career, and yet, in a split second, he had revealed a flaw he didn't even know existed, his bias. I didn't know," Thomas muttered, trying to make sense of the situation. His voice was quieter now, lacking the authority he'd had moments earlier. He shifted in his seat again, trying to avoid her gaze, but Erica was standing right in front of him, her calm presence unshaken. "I didn't think you did," she said softly, her tone polite but with an unmistakable hint of disappointment. It wasn't anger in her voice, no. It was something far more powerful. It was the quiet disappointment of someone who had seen this kind of behavior before, someone who had expected more from a person in Thomas's position. Thomas's stomach churned. He had been quick to judge her, to assume she didn't belong in first class, even though he had no idea who she was. The more he thought about it, the more embarrassed he became. How many times had he assumed things about people based on their appearance? How many times had he treated others as though they didn't belong in the spaces he considered his own? The shame was creeping in now, but it wasn't just the embarrassment of being wrong. It was the realization that his behavior had been rooted in something far uglier. Bias. "Look," Thomas started, but his words faltered. What could he say? What could he do to undo the awkwardness he had caused? How could he fix the damage he had already done? Erica didn't give him the chance to make excuses. She stepped back, giving him space, and looked him directly in the eye. "You don't need to say anything," she said, her voice still calm, but more direct now. "I just wanted you to know that the seat you're sitting in is mine, but I can't say I'm surprised by how quickly you made assumptions about me. It happens all the time." Thomas felt his heart drop. There was no denying it now. He had been wrong. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his judgment, but he had let his biases cloud his understanding. He had treated Erica like she didn't belong in first class, simply because of the way she looked. The shame of his actions washed over him, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable. I'm sorry," Thomas finally said, the words barely escaping his lips. He wasn't sure if it was enough, if an apology would ever be enough to make up for the way he had treated her. But it was the only thing he could offer in that moment. Erica, to her credit, didn't respond with anger or frustration. She simply nodded, acknowledging his apology without further comment. For a long moment, the two of them stood there in silence. Thomas couldn't bring himself to look at her directly, too embarrassed by his own actions. Erica, on the other hand, remained composed, her expression unreadable. She wasn't angry, but there was an undeniable sadness in her eyes, a sadness that came from being judged based on nothing more than appearance, a sadness that came from knowing how many people shared Thomas's mindset. Finally, Erica turned toward the front of the plane, walking down the aisle with a quiet dignity that made Thomas feel even more small. As she passed, a few passengers who had been watching the exchange exchanged looks, their whispers growing louder as the tension in the air was palpable. Thomas sat there, still reeling from the revelation, his mind racing with thoughts of how he had acted and what that said about him. The rest of the flight would pass in a blur for Thomas. He had no interest in the luxury of first class anymore. He couldn't enjoy the comfort of his seat, the plush armrests, or the view out of the large window. His mind kept drifting back to Erica, to the way he had judged her, and the quiet authority with which she had handled the situation. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had just learned an important lesson, a lesson that, no matter how much he tried to deny it, had been long overdue. As the plane started to taxi down the runway, Thomas couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in his chest. The engines roared to life, but the noise did little to drown out the thoughts racing through his mind. He had tried to push the situation out of his head, to focus on the flight ahead, but the weight of his earlier actions lingered like a shadow. Every passing moment only seemed to make it more clear just how wrong he had been. In the cabin, Erica had already settled into the cockpit, preparing for takeoff, while Thomas remained in his seat, looking out the window, barely noticing the people around him. His mind replayed the entire encounter over and over, each time with a new sense of realization. He had judged Erica without cause, and now the truth felt like a punch to the gut. He wasn't used to feeling this way. His life had been built around controlling situations, making decisions, and being right. But here, in the air, with nothing but the vast sky ahead of him, he was forced to face how wrong he had been. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt out of control. He had thought of himself as someone who had mastered the art of reading people, of understanding who belonged where. But in one moment, all of that had shattered. Erica hadn't just been another passenger. She had been a symbol of everything he had failed to see. He had dismissed her based on the color of her skin, based on the stereotypes he didn't even realize he held, and it had been so easy for him to do so. The realization didn't hit him all at once, but now, as the plane gained altitude and the world below became smaller, the truth became harder to ignore. He had done something more than just make a mistake. He had acted out of privilege, out of assumptions, and now he couldn't stop thinking about the weight of it all. Erica had shown restraint and poise, while he had reacted out of discomfort and ignorance. In the cockpit, Erica had already begun her pre-flight checks, preparing for the journey ahead. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had done this hundreds of times before. But today it was different. The air felt heavier, the silence more profound. She was used to the occasional stares or comments that came from passengers who didn't expect to see a black woman in charge of an aircraft. But something about today felt different. It wasn't just the uncomfortable glances she had received from Thomas or the awkward tension in the cabin. It was the weight of what had happened and how it had affected her. She had experienced these moments before, where people judged her without ever knowing her, without considering her abilities, her experience, or her qualifications. It was an unfortunate part of her job, one that she had learned to ignore over time. But today, the sting was sharper. Maybe it was because she had hoped, for just a moment, that people had moved past these assumptions. Maybe it was because, just for a second, she had thought that being qualified and professional would be enough to silence any doubts. As the flight climbed higher into the sky, Erica set her eyes on the horizon. The clouds were thick and swirling, but she had faced more difficult situations than this. The subtle biases people carried were something she had learned to work through, not just in the cockpit, but in every aspect of her life. Today, though, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Her own thoughts weighed on her. She had tried to maintain her composure in front of Thomas, but it wasn't always easy. She had been so sure that the situation would resolve itself without much of a fuss, but instead, it had opened up a new chapter in her own understanding of the prejudice she still faced. Back in the cabin, Thomas finally pulled his eyes away from the window and looked around. His fellow passengers were chatting quietly, oblivious to the tension that had unfolded moments before. Everyone was going about their day, but Thomas couldn't help but feel like he had become the subject of an unspoken judgment. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the quiet of the plane now a stark contrast to the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. What did he do now? How could he fix something so deeply ingrained in his own thinking? He couldn't simply apologize to Erica, not after everything that had happened. The apology would be shallow, words that he had uttered too easily before, words that wouldn't undo the hurt he had caused. The real work, he realized, needed to come from within. For the rest of the flight, Thomas sat in silence. The moments stretched on, the hours ticking by as the plane soared above the clouds. He could feel the quiet pressure of the situation pressing against him, and he knew it wasn't just Erica who would be affected by his actions. It was everyone who had ever been in her position, everyone who had been judged based on something they couldn't control, everyone who had faced prejudice and discrimination in the world. Erica had shown him what it meant to be the bigger person, to remain calm even when confronted with judgment and ignorance. Thomas, however, felt like a child in comparison, like someone who had just learned a hard lesson the most painful way possible. And as the flight continued, he began to wonder how many other lessons he had yet to learn about himself and the world around him. The plane flew on, cutting through the clouds as the minutes passed by in what felt like an eternity to Thomas. He couldn't stop thinking about the earlier exchange, the embarrassment creeping over him every time his mind drifted back to Erica's composed, almost serene response to his assumptions. He wanted to be angry at himself, but he couldn't. There was no excuse for the way he had acted, no justification for his dismissive attitude. He had made a choice based on an ingrained bias he hadn't even realized he carried, and now he was forced to confront it. Erica, on the other hand, was still in the cockpit, focused and professional. She had a job to do, but unlike Thomas, she couldn't simply bury the encounter and move on. The injustice of it lingered with her. She'd faced moments like this many times before, but each instance was still painful. Each time, it chipped away at the idealistic version of the world she wanted to believe in. A world where people were judged by their actions, their skills, and not by the color of their skin. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated or judged simply for being a black woman in a predominantly white and male-dominated industry. This time, though, it stung more than usual. The situation hadn't just been an isolated incident between two strangers. It had happened in front of an entire cabin full of people, and Thomas had made no effort to hide his judgment. Erica knew that he wasn't the only one who would make assumptions about her based on her appearance. How many others had silently questioned her qualifications, her ability, without ever asking? She'd lost count. But Erica wasn't one to show weakness. She had learned long ago how to navigate through these moments, how to carry herself with dignity even when others failed to do the same. She had worked hard to get to this point in her career, proving herself time and time again. It wasn't just about flying planes. It was about breaking barriers, about changing perceptions, about making people see her for who she truly was. And yet, here she was, once again, forced to prove her worth to someone who had never even considered the possibility of a black woman in control of a flight. The announcement over the intercom pulled Erica out of her thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at 35,000 feet, and we'll be serving drinks shortly. Please sit back and relax." The gentle, calm voice of the flight attendant echoed through the cabin. Erica went through her pre-planned checklist for the flight, confirming everything was operating smoothly, but her mind kept wandering back to Thomas and the quiet hurt of the earlier exchange. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Thomas had settled back in his seat, trying to gather his thoughts. The apology he had given earlier had felt hollow, forced almost. He wanted to do better, to change, but he wasn't sure how. What did it mean to really change? Was it just about saying sorry and moving on, or was there more to it? He felt like he needed to do something to make things right, but what could he possibly do? He hadn't just wronged Erica, he had wronged himself in a way that left him questioning everything he had taken for granted. The food cart moved up the aisle, and Thomas absent-mindedly accepted a drink from the flight attendant. He took a sip, but didn't really taste it. His mind was far away, caught in the turmoil of self-reflection. He couldn't help but feel small, like a man who had been living in a world where everything was neatly ordered, where he had known his place and everyone else had theirs. And now, that order had been shattered. He glanced out the window, staring at the endless expanse of blue and clouds. He couldn't remember the last time he had been so unsettled, so unsure of his own actions. It wasn't just about being rude or inconsiderate anymore. It was about realizing how deeply his views were influenced by the world around him, the subtle messages of bias that had shaped his perception of others. It was about realizing that Erica's mere presence had shaken him, had made him uncomfortable, not because of anything she had done, but because he had allowed himself to believe that someone like her didn't belong in a place like this. For the first time in a long time, Thomas was forced to confront the fact that the world he had built around himself, this comfortable, safe world, was not as flawless as he had once believed. People like Erica, who had fought their way through barriers to get to where they were, had been living in a world that had never truly accepted them, never truly seen them. Thomas had been blind to that, and now that blindness was weighing on him, pressing him down as he sat there in his first-class seat. Back in the cockpit, Erica felt the subtle changes in the air. She had been through this before, the strange, uncomfortable silence that followed an encounter like the one she had with Thomas. It was as if the entire cabin had been aware of what had happened, even if no one had spoken a word. She couldn't help but wonder if they had been watching, judging Thomas in the same way he had judged her. Did they see the subtle shift in power, the way she had quietly taken control of the situation without ever raising her voice? She hoped so. But more than that, she hoped that one day it would no longer be necessary for people to learn these lessons the hard way. Thomas, meanwhile, wasn't ready to let go of what had happened. He couldn't forget it. The flight continued smoothly, but the distance between the takeoff and landing felt vast to Thomas. He had tried to focus on the calm of the journey, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Erica. He thought about how she had handled the entire situation with such grace and poise, despite the discomfort he had caused her. She hadn't raised her voice or demanded anything. She had simply stated the truth, and the weight of it had left him reeling. As the hours passed, Thomas found himself unable to escape the growing feeling of regret. He thought about the number of times he had dismissed people, assumed they didn't belong in certain spaces simply because of how they looked. How many opportunities had he missed to truly see others for who they were instead of who he expected them to be? He had lived much of his life believing that the world was divided neatly into roles that people fit into. And today, Erica had shown him just how wrong he was. Thomas couldn't deny the discomfort he felt at the thought of his own ignorance. He had been raised in a world where success was measured by appearance, wealth, and power, things he had in abundance. But today he realized how easily that world could lead him to treat others as if they didn't matter, as if their worth was defined by something external. Erica had been a living reminder of his own privilege, and he hated himself for not seeing it sooner. The seatbelt sign pinged on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the approach to their destination. Thomas was jolted out of his thoughts. He had barely noticed how far they had come in the air, as the flight had become nothing more than a blur of his own mind wrestling with guilt. He turned his attention back to the window, watching the landscape below as it grew nearer, but his mind was still a million miles away. It was then that he heard the soft click of the cockpit door opening. For a moment, he didn't realize what was happening. He turned in his seat, and there she was, Erica, walking back through the cabin toward the front, now in her flight uniform, with the same composed look on her face. It was clear that the earlier tension had not affected her as much as it had affected him. She walked with purpose, nodding politely to a few passengers who greeted her as she passed by. Thomas watched her for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of his actions. He wanted to apologize again, to say something more than just the words he had offered before, but the thought of it seemed almost futile. What could he say to truly make amends for what he had done? Could an apology ever be enough? As Erica walked past, she caught his eye. For a brief moment their gazes met, and Thomas felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would say something. He didn't expect forgiveness, but a word of acknowledgement would have made the awkwardness easier to bear. But Erica didn't say anything. She simply nodded at him, with the same calm expression she had worn all day. Her eyes seemed to speak volumes, though. There was no anger, no judgment, just an unspoken understanding. She knew what had happened. She knew how he had treated her. And yet there was no bitterness in her gaze. It was as if she had long ago accepted that people like Thomas would make assumptions, would judge her simply because of who she was. And in some strange way, that realization stung even more than anything he had felt up to that point. For a moment, Thomas just sat there, rooted to his seat, watching her disappear into the cockpit. He knew she wasn't going to offer him anything more. She didn't owe him anything. And yet, her composure left him feeling even smaller. He had expected a confrontation, a moment of judgment, something to make him feel justified in his own anger. But instead, he had been met with silence and poise, a silence that spoke louder than words ever could. As the plane began its descent, Thomas found himself reflecting on the difference between their two worlds. Erica had earned her place in the sky, commanding a multi-million-dollar aircraft, while he had simply assumed his place because of the privilege he had been born into. She had worked for everything she had, and she had done so with grace and dignity. He, on the other hand, had been blind to that. The plane's wheels hit the runway with a soft thud, but the jolt of landing did little to shake the feeling that had taken root in Thomas's chest. He had arrived at his destination, but he still had a long way to go. He knew that an apology wasn't going to undo everything he had done, but for the first time, he understood that change had to start with himself. Erica had shown him that. The question now was, could he change? Could he confront the biases that had been ingrained in him for so long, and could he make amends for his actions? Thomas knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but as the plane rolled to a stop, he realized that the only way to make things right was to start with the small steps, the ones that began with taking responsibility and confronting the prejudices he had allowed to shape his view of the world. As the plane came to a halt and the seatbelt sign turned off, Thomas felt a heavy silence in the air. The usual rush to gather belongings and disembark seemed far away, as if it were happening on another plane entirely. Everyone else around him was already preparing to leave, chatting among themselves, while Thomas sat motionless in his seat, his hands still gripping the armrests. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, perhaps some sort of sign, some way to make the lingering discomfort go away. But as the passengers stood and began moving toward the exit, Thomas realized there was nothing to be done. His actions had already spoken louder than any words he could muster. The truth was, he didn't know how to face Erica again. What could he say to someone who had shown him more grace and maturity than he had ever shown her? He had been the one in the wrong, and yet it was her who had carried the situation with dignity. He had judged her, made assumptions based on nothing but the color of her skin, and now all he felt was a deep sense of regret. As the other passengers disembarked, he stayed seated, watching Erica walk past him once again. This time, she didn't even glance in his direction. Thomas wanted to call out to her, to offer a real apology, but the words felt inadequate. What could he say to make up for the way he had treated her? The plane began to empty, and soon Thomas found himself alone in the cabin. The silence around him was deafening. He could still hear the soft hum of the engines, but the noise only seemed to magnify his internal conflict. He had spent years building a life of comfort, of privilege, of certainty, but now, in this moment, everything felt uncertain. His own assumptions, his own biases, had been laid bare, and they were harder to ignore than ever before. The truth was, he didn't know what to do next. He finally stood up, gathering his things and walking toward the exit, but his mind was still spinning. As he stepped into the terminal, the reality of the situation hit him once again. The last few hours had been a wake-up call, a reminder that the world he had been so comfortable in wasn't as clear-cut as he had once thought. He had been given a glimpse into the kind of discrimination that many people faced every day, and it had been an uncomfortable truth that he couldn't ignore. Outside the plane, he could see Erica standing by the gate, talking to the flight crew. She looked so at ease, so completely in control of everything around her. And yet, Thomas knew she had likely faced countless moments just like the one they had shared earlier, times when people had underestimated her, treated her as if she didn't belong. He wondered how many other passengers had made similar assumptions about her, how many had silently judged her for no other reason than the way she looked. As Thomas walked past her, he hesitated. He thought about stopping, about saying something, but the words never came. It wasn't that he didn't want to apologize, it was that he wasn't sure how to do it in a way that felt meaningful. How could he express the shame, the regret, the realization that he had been wrong all along? Erica looked up as he passed, and for a brief moment their eyes met again. Thomas saw no judgment in her gaze, only the same calm, composed expression she had shown all along. There was no anger, no harsh words, just silence. It was almost as if she had already forgiven him, not because he had asked for it, but because she had moved past it. She had faced what he had done and had chosen to remain professional, to not let his actions define her. For the first time, Thomas felt the weight of his privilege in a way that was impossible to ignore. He had lived his life assuming that everything in his world, every seat, every room, every privilege, was his to occupy. But now he saw how fragile that worldview was. It was all built on assumptions and biases, and the only way to truly change was to unlearn everything he had taken for granted. As he walked away, he knew that the journey he had started that day wasn't over. He didn't know exactly what the next steps would be, but one thing was clear. The road to understanding, to growth, would be long, but maybe, just maybe, he could start by facing the discomfort he had caused and making sure that, from this moment on, he treated others with the same respect and dignity that he now understood they deserved. Erica's calmness stayed with him as he exited the terminal, her unspoken message ringing louder in his mind than any apology could. He had learned a hard lesson that day, and while it would take time to fully grasp the depth of it, he knew one thing for sure: change had to start with him, and it had to start now. As Thomas made his way through the bustling terminal, his steps felt slower than usual. The crowds around him seemed distant, as though he were moving through a world that no longer made sense. His mind, once focused solely on success and the predictable rhythm of his everyday life, now raced with questions he didn't know how to answer. What did it mean to be a truly respectful person? What did it mean to confront his biases and make real change? The answers didn't come easily, and he realized that there was no quick fix for the years of assumptions that had shaped his worldview. The airport's bright lights seemed to blur as he walked past travelers who were in their own worlds, unaware of the internal storm swirling inside him. He had spent his whole life believing that he was a man who treated others fairly, that he judged people based on merit and character. But in that moment, when he had dismissed Erica, he had seen just how wrong he was. He had been blind to the invisible barriers that many people, like her, faced every day. It wasn't just about race, Thomas realized. It was about the way people were treated based on their appearance, their background, and their assumptions about who they were. Erica had been the target of that kind of prejudice, but she had faced it with a kind of strength he hadn't known how to appreciate until now. As he walked toward the exit, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The sound startled him, but he pulled it out and saw a message from his colleague back at the office, asking if he was ready for the meeting later in the afternoon. Normally, he would have responded right away, eager to get back to work, to return to the comfort of the predictable. But now, as he stared at the message, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened. His mind was still in the clouds, still reeling from the impact of his encounter with Erica. He decided to step outside, to clear his head. The airport terminal doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the fresh air hit his face like a sudden jolt. For a moment he closed his eyes, feeling the breeze on his skin. It was as if the world outside had opened up in a way that felt new, as if the sky was just a little bit wider, and the ground beneath him was firmer. He knew he needed to change, but how? Where did he even begin? Just as he was lost in thought, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from the airline, the same airline Erica worked for. The subject line read, "Important, Incident Report Review." Curiosity piqued, he opened the email, which detailed the situation that had occurred on the flight. It outlined the actions taken by the staff and the protocols in place for resolving customer complaints. However, what struck him most was the mention of Erica's role in the event. The email acknowledged that while there had been a misunderstanding with the seating, the real issue was the way in which Thomas had treated Erica. It didn't explicitly say it, but the message was clear. The airline had noticed. They had seen the uncomfortable moment between them, and the language of the email seemed to subtly call attention to the fact that it wasn't just a simple error in seating. It was a question of respect. The company was already looking into how to handle these situations more thoughtfully in the future. Thomas sat down on a nearby bench, staring at the email. He hadn't expected this level of attention to be drawn to the incident. It wasn't just about his actions anymore. It was about the system, the way things were done, the invisible assumptions that had shaped his behavior. He felt an odd sense of unease, mixed with a new sense of responsibility. It wasn't enough to apologize to Erica or to himself. This had to be a wake-up call, a realization that, like it or not, people were watching. And not just watching, but also holding him accountable for his actions. He began to type a response to the email. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't just ignore this. He had to acknowledge what had happened, both to the airline and to Erica, even if he wasn't sure how to do it. He was stumbling through the process, unsure of his next steps, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. As he typed, he thought about Erica again, the calmness with which she had handled the entire situation. She had known exactly who she was, where she belonged, and had carried herself with grace and strength. She hadn't asked for his approval or validation, and yet, in a strange way, that made her far more powerful than anyone who sought to judge her. The more Thomas reflected on it, the more he realized that it wasn't enough to just be sorry for his actions. It wasn't enough to just acknowledge that he had been wrong. The real work lay in changing how he viewed the world, how he interacted with people, and how he held himself accountable for his biases. It wasn't about making a single apology and moving on. It was about actively working to ensure that he would never make the same mistake again. Thomas hit send on the email, and for the first time, he didn't feel as though he were avoiding the consequences of his actions. He had taken a step. It was a small one, but it was something. And in that moment, he realized that the journey wasn't about perfection. It was about trying, learning, and doing better. As he stood up and began walking back into the terminal, the weight of the situation still lingered, but now it felt different. The shame had softened, replaced by a quiet resolve. There was a long road ahead of him, he knew that much. But maybe, just maybe, he could start making things right, one step at a time. The days that followed felt like a blur to Thomas. He tried to immerse himself in his work, hoping to distract himself from the weight of the situation, but the memory of what had happened aboard the flight lingered. The story of his actions, though quiet, gnawed at him, resurfacing in unexpected moments. He found himself looking at people differently now, questioning his first impressions, wondering if he had ever misjudged someone the way he had misjudged Erica. At work, Thomas noticed small things, little comments from colleagues, microaggressions that he had once brushed off or ignored. Now they felt like glaring flashes of truth that he couldn't avoid. He began to pay closer attention to how people spoke about others, how they judged without knowing the full story. It unsettled him because he realized how pervasive this kind of thinking was, how ingrained in his daily life. The company he worked for, a firm in the finance sector, was no different. The culture was one of privilege, where the suits and ties of those who had made it to the top were the most visible markers of success. But now, every meeting, every conversation felt strained. He could no longer ignore the layers of bias that shaped decisions, even the smallest ones. He had been part of that world, part of that system, and it was like a veil had been lifted, exposing the truth he had never wanted to see. It was after one such meeting that he found himself walking into the elevator, deep in thought, when his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Erica. She had emailed him acknowledging his apology, but this time the words she had written were different. It wasn't just a polite response, it was a message that showed understanding and even a hint of forgiveness. She had been through this before, he realized. She had been forced to navigate the world with people like him, people who held assumptions about who belonged where, who deserved what. But still, she had found it in herself to respond with kindness. Thomas read the email again, letting the weight of her words settle in. Erica's message wasn't about condemning him, it wasn't about placing blame. It was about understanding that change was a long, often uncomfortable process, and that people who were willing to face their biases and work toward growth were worthy of encouragement, not judgment. Her words, though simple, felt like a guide for him moving forward, a roadmap of how he could begin to make amends for his past actions. After reading the email, he sat at his desk for a moment, considering his next move. He knew that acknowledging his mistakes wasn't enough. The real challenge was going to be showing, not just telling, that he had changed. He was going to have to put in the work, and that meant not just changing how he saw others, but also actively speaking out when he saw injustice, no matter how small it seemed. Erica had shown him how to be more than just someone who apologized. She had shown him how to be part of the solution. The following weekend, Thomas attended a seminar on unconscious bias that his company had arranged. He had signed up reluctantly, more out of obligation than interest, but now, sitting in the crowded conference room, he found himself paying attention in a way he never had before. The speaker was a woman who had spent her career working in diversity and inclusion, and her presentation hit him hard. She didn't just talk about the surface-level issues, she dug into the deep-rooted beliefs people carried, the biases they didn't even know they held. As she spoke, Thomas realized how much he had internalized these biases over the years. He had assumed that the way he viewed the world was the correct way, that his experiences and his worldview were universal. But in reality, he had been blind to the experiences of so many people around him, people like Erica, who lived their lives constantly having to prove themselves, to fight for the space that was rightfully theirs. By the end of the seminar, Thomas felt a sense of shame that wasn't as crippling as it had been before, but still powerful enough to make him want to do more. He didn't just want to apologize anymore, he wanted to actively dismantle the biases he had held for so long, but he knew that wasn't going to happen overnight. Change, he realized, required more than just acknowledging the problem. It required action. It required a commitment to unlearning the habits of a lifetime and actively challenging those around him when they made assumptions based on race, gender, or background. As he walked out of the seminar room, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He knew that the work he had to do wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. He couldn't go back to the way he had been, not after everything he had learned. Erica had opened his eyes to a truth he had been too afraid to see, and now it was up to him to do the hard work of change. A few weeks later, Thomas found himself on another flight, this time to a business meeting in a different city. The flight was uneventful, no awkward confrontations, no discomfort hanging in the air. But as the plane took off, Thomas couldn't help but look around the cabin and wonder how many people, like Erica, had been judged before even stepping onto the plane. How many others had been underestimated, treated as if they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. This time, though, something was different. He had paid attention. He had listened. He had learned. When the flight attendant passed by, Thomas caught her eye. It wasn't much, but he smiled, genuinely. A small gesture, but one that felt more sincere than any he had made in a long time. He realized then that change wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about the little things, the moments when you choose to be kind, when you choose to see someone for who they truly are, not for who you expect them to be. As he sat back in his seat, watching the clouds roll by outside the window, Thomas felt a quiet sense of pride. The road to real change was still long, and he knew he had many more lessons to learn. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. A path that, with time and effort, could make a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others, too. He thought about Erica again, her strength, her quiet dignity. She had faced his assumptions with calm and poise, and now he was working to face his own biases with the same resolve. Change was coming, and though it wouldn't happen overnight, he was determined to stay on the journey one step at a time. The weeks passed, and Thomas found himself slowly but surely changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. At first, it was small things, simple moments when he caught himself before making a snap judgment, when he consciously chose to listen more than he spoke. He started to seek out opportunities to challenge his own assumptions, questioning the beliefs that had shaped so much of his life. In meetings at work, he found himself speaking up when someone made a biased remark, when someone used language that reinforced stereotypes. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when he felt like he was walking a tightrope, unsure if he was doing the right thing. But he knew that silence wasn't an option anymore. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting, Thomas sat at his desk, looking out of the window. The city skyline stretched before him, the sun casting long shadows across the buildings. He thought about the journey he had taken since that fateful flight. What had started as an uncomfortable moment of confrontation had blossomed into something more, a realization that change didn't just come from being sorry, but from actively doing better. He hadn't yet fully earned forgiveness from anyone, least of all Erica, but he knew he had started to put in the work. He began to think more deeply about the ways his privilege had shaped his life. The truth was, he had never been forced to confront the limitations of his world until Erica had unwittingly forced him to see it. The more he reflected, the more he saw how easily he had taken certain things for granted: his position in life, his easy access to power, the assumption that he belonged in the spaces he entered. Erica had shown him how fragile that worldview was, and now it felt like he was seeing everything through a different lens. Thomas reached for his phone and, without thinking twice, typed out a message to Erica. He had been thinking about this moment for a while, but now, sitting in his office, the words seemed to come naturally. "Dear Erica, I hope this message finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about what happened on that flight and wanted to take the time to truly apologize. I realize now how wrong I was to judge you, to make assumptions based on your appearance. I'm working every day to be better, to confront my biases and ensure I don't make the same mistakes again. I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that your strength and grace that day had a profound impact on me. Thank you for showing me the truth. Thomas." He sat there, staring at the message. It felt real this time, not just a hollow apology, but an acknowledgement of the change he had been working toward. He hesitated for a moment, but then pressed send. There was a quiet sense of relief that washed over him as he leaned back in his chair. No matter how Erica responded, he knew that the apology was just one step in a much longer journey of growth. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. A few days passed, and Thomas went about his usual routine: work, meetings, social obligations. But this time, there was something different about how he moved through the world. He didn't just walk into rooms with the same confidence he once had. Now, he entered spaces with a certain awareness, a keen sense of observation that hadn't existed before. He paid attention to how people spoke to one another, how they made assumptions based on appearance or background, and how those assumptions shaped the dynamics in the room. One afternoon, while in a client meeting, Thomas caught a glimpse of a colleague, Derek, who had been making offhand jokes about a fellow employee. The comments weren't overtly racist or discriminatory, but they had an undertone of bias that Thomas couldn't ignore. A year ago, he might have brushed it off, letting it slide under the guise of just joking, or that's just how Derek is. But now Thomas felt a pang of discomfort. He knew better, and more importantly, he couldn't stay silent any longer. "Actually, Derek," Thomas interjected, his voice calm but firm, "I think it's important to recognize that comments like that can be harmful, even if they're not intended that way." The room went quiet for a moment, the conversation shifting as others turned their attention toward him. Thomas could feel the weight of the moment. It wasn't easy to speak up, to challenge the norms that had been allowed to persist for so long. But he stood his ground. Derek blinked, clearly taken aback. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "I know you didn't," Thomas said, "but that's exactly why we need to be more aware of how our words affect others. It's not just about intent, but about impact." There was a brief pause before the conversation shifted, and the meeting continued, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of satisfaction that lingered. Speaking up wasn't easy, and it didn't always lead to immediate change. But in that moment, he had taken a small step toward creating an environment where biases weren't just accepted as the norm. He had learned, in part because of Erica, that silence only perpetuates the problem. Change started with action, no matter how small. That evening, after dinner, Thomas checked his email. There was a message from Erica, and his heart skipped a beat as he clicked it open. He hadn't expected a reply, but there it was, her response, kind and thoughtful. "Thomas, thank you for your message. I appreciate your honesty and the efforts you're making. Change isn't easy, but it's a necessary journey, and it's encouraging to know you're committed to that path. I'm glad I could have an impact on your growth. Keep doing the work and keep challenging the systems that need to change. Wishing you all the best, Erica. Thomas sat there for a long time, rereading her words. There was no judgment, no bitterness, only an encouragement to continue on his path. It was the kind of message he had hoped for, but he hadn't truly expected. And yet, it felt like a validation of everything he had been working toward. The weight that had hung over him since that flight seemed to lift just a little. He wasn't done yet, he knew that much. But this was the beginning of something real, something lasting. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of peace, knowing he was heading in the right direction. Over the next few months, Thomas's world continued to shift. The work he had begun was still ongoing, but with every day, it became a little easier to see the world through a clearer lens. He began to notice more, whether it was in his workplace, his social circles, or simply walking down the street. He saw how ingrained the systems of bias and privilege were, and how important it was to continually challenge them. At work, things were changing as well. He began to see the effects of his actions, small though they were. His colleagues started asking him questions, seeking advice on how to handle difficult situations, on how to confront bias in the workplace. It was clear that others were beginning to follow his lead, and while he wasn't sure if he was leading them in the right direction, he knew that he was doing his best. He didn't expect everyone to change overnight, and he knew that he still had a long road ahead. But every small shift was a victory. Every time he spoke out, every time he held a colleague accountable, he felt like he was making a difference. It wasn't just about apologizing anymore. It was about creating an environment where people understood the value of respect, empathy, and fairness. Then, one day, as Thomas walked into his office, he was greeted by a colleague who had been following up on his earlier efforts to address workplace bias. "You know," the colleague said, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in that meeting a few months ago. I've started challenging some things myself. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Thomas smiled. It was a small moment, a quiet acknowledgement that his efforts had been noticed. It was the kind of moment he had hoped for, but hadn't expected. And in that moment, Thomas knew that while he couldn't undo everything he had done, he was doing everything he could to make sure that others wouldn't have to face the same judgment and assumptions that Erica had. The work was far from finished, but with every day he moved closer to a world that was just a little bit more understanding, a little bit more inclusive. And for the first time, Thomas felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The more time passed, the more Thomas began to realize that his journey was not a linear one. There were days when he felt like he had made significant progress, when he could see the impact of his efforts, both in himself and in others. But there were also days when the weight of the past would come crashing down on him, and he'd feel like he was back at square one, unsure of how to proceed. But he knew that this was part of the process, the struggle to unlearn deeply rooted behaviors, to challenge biases that had been ingrained in him over a lifetime. It wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. One afternoon, during a company-sponsored diversity event, Thomas found himself in a conversation with an old friend, Mike, who had been working at the firm with him for years. Mike had always been a strong advocate for equality, and Thomas admired him for it. But as they spoke, Thomas realized just how much had changed in his own perspective. "I've noticed something different about you lately," Mike said, taking a sip of his coffee. "You're not just talking about this stuff anymore, you're living it. I mean, you've always been a good guy, but now it feels like you're really challenging the way things have always been." Thomas paused for a moment, considering Mike's words. "I guess I've just started to see things differently. It's not just about being sorry for the past. It's about making sure I don't repeat the same mistakes in the future, and helping others see that too." Mike nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's what it's all about. Change doesn't come from just saying the right words. It comes from showing up and doing the work even when it's hard." Those words stuck with Thomas. He realized that, for so long, he had been content with the idea that being a good person was enough. But now he knew that goodness wasn't passive. It was active. It required effort, discomfort, and a willingness to challenge the status quo, even when it meant confronting parts of himself he hadn't wanted to face. Thomas's transformation was not confined to his work life. It began to seep into other areas of his life, his friendships, his family relationships, and even how he viewed the world at large. He started questioning not just his own actions, but the systems that upheld inequality. He became more involved in local initiatives that sought to address social justice, and began volunteering with organizations that worked on issues like racial inequality and economic disparity. He also began speaking at events about his journey, about the lessons he had learned, and about the importance of confronting bias, even when it felt uncomfortable. There were times when it was hard, when he questioned whether he was doing enough or whether his efforts were even making a difference. But then he would receive messages from people he had spoken to, telling him that his words had inspired them to take action in their own lives. And it was in those moments that Thomas felt the weight of his efforts become a little lighter. One evening, as he sat in a local community center, listening to a speaker talk about the importance of intersectionality and how race, gender, and class interconnect, Thomas reflected on how far he had come. He was no longer the man who had assumed his place in the world because of his privilege. He was beginning to understand the complexities of the world around him, and with that understanding came a deep sense of responsibility to do better, not just for himself, but for others. Erica's words still echoed in his mind. Change isn't easy, but it's a necessary journey. She had been right. The journey had only just begun, and while he had made progress, there was still much work to be done. Months later, Thomas found himself standing in a small, modest office building, the walls adorned with photos of community events and the faces of people who had been part of the fight for justice. He was here to meet with a group of activists who had been working tirelessly to address inequality in local schools, and he had been invited to speak about his journey and the lessons he had learned along the way. As he stood at the podium, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. He wasn't an expert on these issues. He wasn't someone who had spent his life fighting for social justice, but he was someone who had learned from his mistakes, someone who had come to understand the value of using his voice and his platform for change. "Thank you for having me," he began, his voice steady, but filled with a quiet resolve. "I've learned a lot in the last few months about myself, about others, and about the world we live in. I've learned that change doesn't just happen. It takes work. It takes facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves and about the systems that perpetuate inequality. And it takes a commitment to doing better, even when it's hard." He spoke about his experiences, about the moment on the plane with Erica that had changed everything for him. He talked about the biases he had unknowingly carried and how he had worked to challenge them in his own life. It wasn't a perfect journey, he said, and it wasn't one that would end any time soon. But it was a journey he was committed to. "As I stand here today, I know I'm not the same person I was when I first boarded that plane. And while I can't undo the harm I've caused, I can do everything in my power to make sure that I continue to grow and that I help others grow too. It's not enough to just acknowledge our mistakes. We need to take responsibility and use our privilege to create a better world for everyone." The room was quiet as he finished, and for a moment Thomas felt the weight of the room's attention. But it was not a heavy weight, it was a weight of purpose, a weight that reminded him of the importance of what he was doing. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or treated as less than. The months continued to pass, and Thomas's commitment to his personal growth never wavered. He continued to speak out against injustice, to stand up for those who didn't have the same privileges he did. He became a mentor to others, helping them navigate their own journeys of self-reflection and growth. He learned that change didn't always come in big, flashy moments. It often came in small, everyday actions, challenging the assumptions people made, holding those around him accountable, and actively listening when others spoke. Thomas found that the more he gave, the more he received. The deeper he dug into the work of challenging bias, the more he realized how interconnected all of this was. His personal growth was tied to the growth of his community, to the growth of society as a whole. And though the work was hard, it was meaningful. He knew that he wasn't alone in this journey. There were countless others who were working to create change, to break down the systems that had held people back for so long. And together, they would make a difference. But through it all, Erica's example remained at the forefront of his mind. She had shown him the power of grace, of resilience, and of quiet strength. She had faced judgment, prejudice, and bias, and had never once wavered in her belief that she belonged. She had inspired him not with words, but with her actions. And as Thomas moved forward, he did so with the knowledge that he could never repay her for the lessons she had taught him. But that didn't mean he couldn't pass those lessons on to others. As the years passed, Thomas continued his journey, committed to being a better version of himself. He never forgot that fateful flight, the moment that had forced him to confront his own biases and begin the work of change. Erica had been the catalyst for his growth, but the journey had been his to take. One day, as he walked through a busy street in the city, he passed a woman standing at a bus stop. She was wearing a uniform, much like the one Erica had worn, and for a moment, Thomas hesitated. He was about to continue on his way when something inside him told him to stop. He turned to her, a gentle smile forming on his face. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and respectful. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you do." The woman looked at him, a little confused, but then smiled back. "Thank you," she said, genuinely surprised by the unexpected compliment. As Thomas continued down the street, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known before. It wasn't about grand gestures or big speeches. It was about the small, everyday moments when we choose to be better, when we choose to treat others with kindness and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. For the first time in a long time, Thomas understood the true meaning of growth, not just as a person, but as a part of the larger world. Change, he realized, was never easy, but it was always worth it. And it had begun all those months ago with a simple mistake and the willingness to learn from it.